Attention, citizens. We bring to you a report most extraordinary and alarming from the streets of our very own metropolis. Sidney Street, Stepney, has become the battleground for anarchy and the rule of law. In the dead of night past, a cabal of foreign revolutionaries laid siege to the sanctity of commerce and peace. The Houndsditch heist, orchestrated by the now-deceased desperado George Gardstein, has escalated into an outright war in our streets, claiming the lives of 3 of Scotland Yard's finest. Our constabulary hunted down these brigands, only to find the serpent's tail at Sidney Street. At the break of dawn this 3rd day of January, gunfire rends the air. London's constables, outmatched by the firepower of these malcontents, have called upon the might of the King's army. Here we see the visage of our Home Secretary Winston Churchill himself. Witness to the ordeal, the Sidney Street siege shall be inscribed in the annals of our city's history, a stark reminder that vigilance is the eternal price of liberty. Sidney Street has become a crucible of fire and smoke. The building, now an inferno, will soon become a fiery tomb for these agents of chaos.
No place in the world is more notorious for its gruesome murders than London's East End. From the infamous killings of Jack the Ripper to the brutal reign of the Cray twins and the chilling Ratcliffe Highway murders of 1811, the area has a dark history that fascinates crime enthusiasts. Adding to this notorious list are 2 closely related events that shook London in the early 20th century: the Houndsditch murders and the Siege of Sidney Street. These incidents, occurring in December 1910 and January 1911, resulted in the deaths of 3 police officers and left 3 others seriously injured, forever etching their names into the annals of London's criminal history. But how did a violent shootout in London's East End capture the attention of an entire nation and even draw in a future prime minister? What was it about this intense standoff that made it a turning point in British history? Welcome to the story of the Siege of Sidney Street, a dramatic armed confrontation that unfolded in the heart of London in 1911. This deadly clash between police forces and anarchist fugitives not only shook the city, but also became one of the most significant events in the history of British law enforcement. It was a defining moment that saw the involvement of military forces, intense media coverage, and even the presence of Winston Churchill, who would later become Prime Minister. The siege marked a pivotal moment in the fight against political extremism and highlighted the evolving relationship between the press, public, and police. In the early 20th century, London's East End was a bustling, diverse, and often volatile part of the city. It was an area shaped by rapid industrialization, poverty, and a large immigrant population. Many Eastern European Jews, fleeing persecution and economic hardship in their homelands, settled in the East End, bringing with them their skills, culture, and, in some cases, radical political ideas. Amid the backdrop of overcrowded housing, poor working conditions, and low wages, the East End became a hotbed for political unrest and radical movements. Anarchism, a political ideology advocating for the abolition of all government and the creation of a stateless society, gained particular traction among some of these immigrant communities. For many, anarchism offered a response to the oppression and exploitation they faced both at home and abroad. However, this period of social and economic upheaval also saw the rise of more extreme elements within the anarchist movement, leading to increased tension with the authorities. Among the most infamous of these radical groups was a small band of Latvian anarchists who became known as the Houndsditch murderers. This group was involved in a botched robbery attempt on December 16, 1910, targeting a jewelry shop in Houndsditch, London. During the attempted heist, the gang was confronted by police officers, leading to a violent altercation in which 3 officers were killed and 2 others seriously injured. The brutality of the crime shocked the public and led to an intense manhunt by the authorities. The Houndsditch murders not only exemplified the growing unrest in London's East End, but also set the stage for the dramatic events that would follow just a few weeks later. The search for the remaining members of the gang culminated in what would become known as the Siege of Sidney Street, a violent confrontation that would capture the attention of the entire nation and mark a significant moment in the history of British law enforcement. Houndsditch is a lengthy street stretching from Bishopsgate to Aldgate High Street, home to various businesses and residences. At 120 Houndsditch, Max Weil ran an import business. On the evening of December 16, 1910, Weil arrived at his premises to find his sister and their housemaid visibly distressed. They reported hearing strange noises coming from the jeweler's shop next door at number 119, suggesting that someone was attempting to break in through the back of the building. Number 119 backed onto a tenement at 11 Exchange Buildings, a location that provided easy access to the rear of the jeweler's shop. Concerned about a possible burglary in progress, Weil decided to alert the authorities. He quickly walked to Bishopsgate Police Station and returned with Constable Piper. Upon arriving at number 11, Constable Piper knocked on the door and briefly spoke with a man inside. The conversation was vague and unsatisfactory, raising Piper's suspicions even further. Realizing that something wasn't right, Piper decided to leave and call for backup, setting in motion a series of events that would soon escalate into a deadly confrontation. Constable Piper returned to the buildings with reinforcements, 3 sergeants and 5 more constables, ready to investigate further. One of the sergeants, Bentley, approached the door and knocked again. The same man who had spoken with Piper earlier opened the door. After a brief and tense exchange, the man attempted to shut the door in Bentley's face, but Sergeant Bentley, refusing to be deterred, pushed his way inside. What happened next was chaos. As Bentley forced his way through the doorway, he was immediately met with 2 gunshots. The bullet struck him in the neck, and he staggered back, mortally wounded and in shock. Standing just behind him, Sergeant Bryant witnessed the gun being turned in his direction. More shots rang out, hitting Bryant in the chest and arm. In the ensuing panic, Constable Woodhams rushed to help his fallen colleagues, but he too was struck, taking a bullet to the thigh. While both Sergeant Bryant and Constable Woodhams survived their injuries, the severity of their wounds forced them to retire from the police force. Sergeant Tucker, however, was not so fortunate. As he moved towards the doorway of number 11, a figure suddenly emerged and fired twice, hitting Tucker in the heart and hip. He collapsed on the spot, dying almost instantly. As chaos erupted inside 11 Exchange Buildings, the assailants made their move to escape. The man who had just fired the fatal shots scuttled out of the building, followed closely by at least 2 other men and a woman. In the darkness, the gang scrambled to flee, but their path was suddenly blocked by Constable Choate, who emerged from the shadows. Determined to stop them, Choate lunged at one of the men, grabbing hold of him in a desperate struggle. The gang responded with brutal force. One of the men fired 4 shots into Choate's leg, while another member came up from behind and shot him twice in the back. Choate fell to the ground, still clutching the man he had managed to grab. A third member of the gang fired again, aiming for Choate, but the bullet struck the man Choate was holding. Injured and unable to fight back, the wounded gang member was dragged away by his accomplices, leaving Constable Choate bleeding out on the pavement, gravely wounded. The slain officers, including Choate, were part of the City of London police force. However, the murderers did not linger. They fled deep into the East End, the territory of the Metropolitan Police, setting off a frantic manhunt that would span across London's diverse neighborhoods. The man who had been accidentally shot by his own accomplices during the chaotic escape was found dead from his wounds in his lodgings the next day. His name was George Gardstein, though this was an alias. Gardstein was the de facto leader of the gang, a small group of Latvian anarchists who called themselves Leesma, which translates to flame. The group consisted of around 13 members, including 2 women. Although they identified as anarchists, further research suggests that the Leesma gang were actually expropriators. Their primary aim was to carry out robberies to fund revolutionary activities, specifically to support Lenin and the Bolshevik movement. One of the gang members, Jacob Peters, would later rise to prominence after the Russian Revolution, becoming the second in command of the Cheka, the notorious Bolshevik secret police. Some modern historians believe it was Peters who fired the fatal shots that killed Sergeants Bentley, Tucker, and Constable Choate, and injured Sergeant Bryant during the Houndsditch robbery. This connection adds another layer to the story, linking the tragic events in London to the broader revolutionary struggles of the early 20th century. Following the Houndsditch robbery and murders, the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police launched a coordinated effort to capture the remaining members of the Leesma gang. By the end of December 1910, several members, including Jacob Peters, had been apprehended. Then, on the evening of January 1, 1911, a mysterious figure entered the city police headquarters at Old Jewry. Disguised and cautious, the man avoided drawing attention to himself. Though his identity was never officially recorded, he is now believed to have been Charles Perelman, a former landlord to several members of the Leesma gang. Perelman came with crucial information. He revealed that two of the gang's most wanted men, Fritz Svars and Joseph Sokolov, were hiding in a room on the second floor of 100 Sidney Street. He also warned the authorities that the men were armed with Mauser pistols, adding urgency to the police efforts to capture the fugitives before they could strike again. This information set the stage for one of the most dramatic confrontations in London's history, the Siege of Sidney Street. In the early hours of January 3, 1911, a long line of police officers quietly made their way through the dark, silent streets of London's East End towards Sidney Street. This narrow road stretches from Commercial Road in the south to where it meets Whitechapel and Mile End Roads in the north. The officers had been given no details about their mission, only that it was dangerous. The gravity of the situation was clear, as only unmarried men were chosen for this operation. Armed with an assortment of outdated weapons, antique revolvers, tube rifles, and shotguns, more suited for display in a museum than for a modern confrontation, the officers knew they were heading into a potentially deadly encounter. Despite their ill-suited armaments, they pressed on, determined to face whatever lay ahead at 100 Sidney Street. As dawn approached, tension filled the air, and the stage was set for a dramatic and violent showdown. Upon arriving at Sidney Street, the police quickly moved to evacuate the houses adjacent to number 100, ensuring the safety of the residents in the neighboring buildings. Next, they carefully cleared the first two floors of number 100 itself, preparing for what they knew could be a violent confrontation. By daybreak, everything was in place for the intense drama that was about to unfold. At 7:30 a.m., the anarchists, Fritz Svars and Joseph Sokolov, were alerted to the police presence outside. The officers banged loudly on the front door and threw pebbles up at the window where the men were holed up. In response, the anarchists fired several shots. Detective Sergeant Ben Leeson was hit and collapsed, gravely wounded. Though Leeson survived his injuries, like Sergeants Bryant and Woodhams before him, he was forced to retire from the police force due to his wounds. The battle had begun, and despite being heavily outnumbered, Svars and Sokolov had the upper hand. Armed with powerful Mauser pistols, they easily outranged the outdated and inadequate weapons of the police. Any hopes that the anarchists might be low on ammunition were quickly dispelled as the gunfight continued. With every shot fired, it became clear that this would be no quick or easy victory for the authorities. As the hours dragged on, it became clear that the police were making no headway in the standoff at Sidney Street. With the anarchists holding their ground and outgunning the officers, the situation seemed to be at a stalemate. Mid-morning, Home Secretary Winston Churchill made the decisive call to escalate the operation by bringing in the army. Shortly thereafter, a detachment of the Scots Guards arrived on the scene. The arrival of the Scots Guards marked a dramatic shift in the balance of power. Armed with powerful Lee Enfield rifles, the soldiers unleashed a relentless barrage of gunfire, systematically tearing apart the building's second floor where the anarchists were entrenched. Under this intense assault, Svars and Sokolov were forced to retreat, moving down to the first and ground floors to continue their resistance. However, even in these lower positions, they remained under heavy fire, making it increasingly difficult for them to maintain their defense against the overwhelming military force. By midday, Home Secretary Winston Churchill arrived at the scene to observe the unfolding events firsthand, positioning himself dangerously close to the front lines. His presence would later spark significant controversy, as many questioned the appropriateness of a high-ranking government official being so directly involved in a police operation. At around 1 o'clock, smoke began to billow from the besieged building. Fire had broken out inside. The situation was rapidly deteriorating for the anarchists. As flames spread, one of the gunmen was spotted at a rear window, desperately firing 2 pistols in a final attempt to hold off the advancing forces. But their resistance was faltering. Soon after, one of the pistols jammed, a clear sign that their time was running out. As the fire spread through the building, the fire brigade was called to the scene. However, under strict orders, their focus was solely on containing the blaze and preventing it from spreading to nearby buildings. Meanwhile, the soldiers intensified their assault, unleashing a barrage of gunfire through the windows of number 100. Amid the chaos, Sokolov briefly appeared at one of the windows. only to be met with a volley of bullets that struck him down instantly. In a final act of defiance, Svars unleashed a desperate burst of return fire, but it was his last stand. As the fire consumed the building, the structure began to collapse. Witnesses caught a final glimpse of Svars lying face down on a bed on the ground floor, his face buried in a pillow. Moments later, the ceiling caved in, sealing his fate. By 2 p.m., the Siege of Sidney Street had come to a dramatic and fiery conclusion. The tragic events of the Houndsditch murders and the Siege of Sidney Street claimed one last victim. When the fire brigade finally entered the smoldering ruins of number 100, District Fire Officer Charles Pearson was struck by falling debris. A piece of masonry fell from above, severing his spine and leaving him paralyzed. Pearson fought valiantly for 6 months, but eventually succumbed to his injuries. To honor his sacrifice, a memorial plaque was unveiled on January 6, 2011, at the site where number 100 Sidney Street once stood, serving as a solemn reminder of the ultimate price paid by those who risked their lives that day. In the wake of the Houndsditch murders and the Siege of Sidney Street, several members of the Leesma gang faced trial. Jacob Peters, along with Yorka Dubov, John Rosen, and Nina Vasilev, were brought to court to answer for their roles in the tragic events. However, the legal proceedings concluded with a surprising outcome. All 4 were acquitted of the Houndsditch murders. Nina Vasilev was found guilty of a minor offense, but this conviction was later overturned on appeal. In the public eye, and in historical accounts, the primary blame for the deaths of the 3 police officers was laid squarely on the shoulders of George Gardstein, Fritz Svars, and Joseph Sokolov. These 3, now deceased, were considered the main perpetrators responsible for the killings, though questions remain about the true extent of each individual's involvement. It's intriguing to imagine how the course of history might have changed if Winston Churchill had been fatally wounded during the chaotic gunfight at Sidney Street. Had Churchill not been there to lead Britain in 1940, the role of Prime Minister would likely have fallen to Lord Halifax, a man known for his inclination towards negotiating peace with Nazi Germany. The entire outcome of World War II, and indeed the future of Europe, could have been drastically different. It's a compelling thought that highlights just how pivotal moments in history can hinge on the narrowest of circumstances. The Siege of Sidney Street had a significant impact on policing and law enforcement in Britain. The violent confrontation underscored the need for better preparation and equipment when facing armed criminals. It sparked a public debate on the appropriate use of police and military force in civilian areas, and the proper handling of such situations to maintain public safety while protecting civil liberties. As a result, there was a push for reforms, including improved training for police officers, clearer guidelines on the use of force, and better collaboration between police and military units in similar situations. The lessons learned from Sidney Street helped shape future law enforcement tactics and policies. The Siege of Sidney Street has left a lasting mark on British culture, and is remembered as one of the most dramatic and notorious events in early 20th century London. It has been depicted in various forms of media, including films, books, and documentaries, capturing the imagination of the public and historians alike. The 1960 film, The Siege of Sidney Street, and numerous documentaries have revisited the story, highlighting the intense standoff and the involvement of future Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The siege stands as an early example of a high-profile police operation covered extensively by the media, illustrating the power of film and photographs to shape public perception and memory. This was one of the first instances where moving images brought a police operation into the public eye, setting a precedent for how the media would cover law enforcement actions in the future. The events in 1911 remind us of the delicate balance between maintaining public order and protecting individual freedoms, a balance that remains relevant in today's world. The siege serves as a poignant example of the complexities involved in law enforcement and the power of the media to shape public perception. It raises important questions. How should authorities handle extreme threats while ensuring the rights and safety of all citizens? How has media coverage of such events evolved? And what impact does it have on our understanding of law and order? These questions continue to resonate, making the Siege of Sidney Street a significant event to study and learn from, even more than a century later. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, please consider giving this video a thumbs up and sharing it with others who might enjoy learning about this piece of East End history. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you won't miss any of our upcoming deep dives into the moments that have shaped our world. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Siege of Sidney Street, so drop a comment below and let's start a conversation. Thanks for watching Dark Sleuth Secrets, and until next time, stay curious and keep sleuthing.